All right, well, thanks everyone. As many of you may know, there was a task force meeting called today by the House Democrats down in Olympia, and so a lot of legislators had to go to that. Senator Warnock and Representative Springer both had to send their apologies and their regrets. And so graciously, Senator Palumbo and Representative Wilcox have both stepped in to represent all things Republican and all things Democrat when it comes to land use, water, and the Hearst decision. So we are going to have just a real open, informal kind of conversation. We really encourage and ask for your engagement. TVW is recording this, as you all know, and so this conversation will be broadcast throughout Washington State as a result of our partnership with them. So first, let me just ask Representative Wilcox, and first, my name is DJ Wilson. I'm one of the hosts of this song and dance. Representative Wilcox, you've had a little more notice than Senator Palumbo, who I literally just grabbed in the hallway. Representative Wilcox has had at least a week or so. Let me ask you to sort of frame up what you see as the sort of Hearst question before the legislature, and how have the House Republicans addressed or tried to address this issue?
Okay, well, first of all, I really think that I should defer to the senior chamber for a 10-minute introduction of the Hearst problem. So, but no, that was just a joke. Okay, how do you frame this? Well, I frame this a little bit differently. I am not really a deeply policy guy. I thought that I was going to come here and write budgets and be on the Ag Committee, but they drug me into leadership right away, and I've just since then been nothing but appropriations and finance. So when it comes to all the deep nuance and also the state of the negotiations, I don't have that much to share. On the other hand, at my family business, Wilcox Farms, we have a number of water rights that date back to originally to the 1910s, and then were kind of redone in 1948, and we just got done with a literally a 10-year and several $100,000 process of redoing all of those rights to kind of update the place of use and the place of withdrawal. And they're some of the largest block of rights on the Nisqually River, and they're upstream and very senior. So, you know, from a personal point of view, I've been around this a lot and spent a lot of my own money in it. And oddly, although I'm on the side that says we need to solve this exempt well problem for rural people, I'm one of the senior water right holders that, you know, you could say is damaged to some extent, or would be better off if they were very rare and hard to get. So I'm involved in this in a strange way. You know, Hearst starts out, probably there's not many people here who haven't heard of it, or they wouldn't be in the room to hear about water. But I'll just kind of share my understanding is we've got a court case that kind of unexpectedly, although I've got some lawyers that I trust, think that probably it was not a bad interpretation of the law. But it has really thrown a monkey wrench into the ability of rural landowners to utilize what has been called for many years an exempt well. An exempt well means that you get to withdraw up to 5,000 gallons of water a day. It was considered to be de minimis. And you could actually use that for business purposes as well. Now, you can't run a food processing plant with 5,000 gallons a day, but you can run a lot of smaller businesses. So it has an impact in rural areas. It's not the most immense immediate impact. I looked up and asked the Department of Ecology how many exempt wells were there, and as I recall, it was 15 to 2,500 exempt wells a year. It also is only a tiny amount of the water that's out there. I've heard the estimate that it's around 1% of the withdrawals, but it is true that it is a more significant portion of the withdrawals in some basins. But I think the reason that it has become such a flashpoint is it's so symptomatic of what's going on in our rural and urban divide. This is one of those things that seems like if you have rural roots and you still are out there, whether you own property or not, you know, you kind of have bought in all your life to the idea that One of the basic dreams that human beings have is to go out in the country and have their own little piece of land. It doesn't have to be big. It might be 5 acres. It's not a ponderosa spread. And you could build a house there. This law didn't, or this court case didn't outlaw building a house. It just outlawed getting an exempt well for it unless you go through these additional steps that are required if the counties are going to run the water business. And it seems to many in the rural world that this is one more blow that have been imposed by city people on, what they consider to be their way of life. And I think that's why it's gotten so emotional for people that are not immediately impacted. Now, we know that this is going to have a longer-term impact on the value of real estate, and because most of our property taxes kind of allow for tax shifts, the people that lose land value are going to see their taxes go down, and people that don't, have their value diminished are going to be paying those taxes. So if you're in a city or a suburban world, you should be concerned about this too. And then on the other hand, if you're a person that lives in the city, you don't have to give 2 seconds thought to where your water comes from. If you're going to build a new house, it's going to be in a development, the water's just going to be there. You might have to pay for it, but the water's going to be there. You're never going to have to worry about that. And there are far, far more new hookups in an urban area than there are in rural areas. So that's another source of, I think, discontent among rural people. We're only asking for about 1,500 of these hookups. That's a couple of months worth of hookups in King County alone. So why do you get it and we don't? And because it's so easy to have those hookups in urban settings, there's no reason, honestly, for an urban person to care. I don't blame them for not caring, especially in the beginning of this whole controversy. There was no reason that it would affect them, and they probably didn't know anyone that was affected. And that also explains why we have this connection between Hearst and the capital budget that is making people so angry. Now, was the capital budget the best connection? Probably not. I don't know. But because the Senate with the Republican majority was so anxious to find a solution, they ran out a bill, they passed it. It had several Democratic votes. So, in that smaller chamber, it was pretty bipartisan, and there was never a bill run out of the House. And I believe that Senate Republicans, and although I wish there was a better vehicle, I agree that they had to find a way to make legislators that mostly represent urban people care about this issue, because ignoring it is not a great thing. If we ignore this, we're also, I think, accepting in the long run the even more rapid strangulation of the rural economy that most of us are here to represent and have deep emotional connections to. So to me, there are some easy, well, they're not easy. Politically, they're not easy. There are some ways to deal with this. Everybody knows that there are far more impactful issues involving in-stream flows, and we should be addressing those. And in today's environment, we have some money that could be used to offset the impacts that these exempt wells make. Republicans are perfectly happy, oddly, to let the Department of Ecology run this program. I think one thing that's unfortunate about the whole situation is that I have heard people blame tribes for the fact that we can't reach a deal. I think that's absolutely wrong. Tribes are they have as much right to advocate for their interests as anybody else in this state. And it's really a political problem that politicians haven't been able to solve yet, because we're hired and elected to make the choices. Everyone is supposed to be able to advocate for their interests. So I don't buy the idea that tribes are at fault here. But they're certainly very interested stakeholders, and I know that they understand that we've got plenty of other problems that we can address when it comes to in-stream flows, and those are legitimate concerns.
Senator Palumbo, let me ask you about this connection to the capital budget. You're a thought leader and a policy leader on climate change and carbon initiatives, but every legislator cares about the capital budget to some degree. So even if Hearst isn't your number one issue, you're impacted by it as a legislator. what are your thoughts on that connection to the capital budget and the holding up of the budget? And also, I'm wondering if you think that this might be more about the divide between the House and the Senate, even though the Senate's a different place now than it was before the election in terms of the majority. But is this about the House and the Senate not figuring things out, or is this about really the partisan and maybe rural-urban divide?
Yeah, thank you very much, DJ, and thank you everybody for coming in. As DJ mentioned, I just walked in off the street, so I am not a Hearst expert. But my seatmate, Derek Stanford, is in the negotiations on the House side. So, and due to the nature of this issue, I've had to become knowledgeable to an extent. So I'm knowledgeable enough to be dangerous on this issue from a policy perspective. Regarding the capital budget question that you asked me, I think it was definitely the wrong move, in my opinion. I know that there's a lot of debate right now about whether or not we should be funding ongoing employee expenses out of the capital budget. I'm still new to the legislature. I didn't even know that was a problem until now. But I think it's a really cruel thing, and I don't mean this to say something bad about my friend JT, who I like very much, but I think it's pretty cruel because, we've got people that are getting laid off right now for Christmas because of an unrelated policy issue. And I think that's unfair to them. I understand that it's leverage for the folks that are holding it out there, but to me that's just wrong when people are going to the holidays without a job because of an unrelated policy issue, because politicians can't get together and find a middle ground. To me that's disgusting. So I don't believe that it's a good idea, and I think that basically what we have is a situation where there's a couple of outside interest groups who are obstinate on this at the moment. Just to back up a little bit to a little background, GT was talking about the care for rural areas. I'm a Democrat who cares about rural areas. I live in a rural area. So I live in the 1st District, which is Montlake Terrace, Briar, Bothell, a little bit of Kirkland, but I live in the unincorporated Snohomish County area. So I live on acreage. I don't have a well myself, but a lot of my neighbors do. And we have exempt wells in the county. So this is an issue I do care about. And a large percentage of my caucus actually does want to get to yes on something. The Warnick bill that passed out of the Senate had, I believe, just Hobbs and Mullet and Taco on it. And, it was essentially a repeal of the Supreme Court case. And that was never going to fly. And from the day that I got elected, I've been ready to vote on whatever the compromise is between the two chambers on Hearst. It's just never been in front of me. So the people that are negotiating this have not been able to find the solution. I will vote on it as soon as it gets to my desk, but I just haven't had that opportunity yet. So that's kind of where I stand on that, itself. But also a little bit of inside baseball. 3:30 in the morning on the last day of session, there was a handshake deal. So, this is something that can get fixed. I don't really know because I'm not in those negotiations, but one caucus backed out of it, at about 3:45 a.m. So I don't know why that happened. I don't know what the problem was, whether it was politics or policy, but there was a path forward to get to yes. And it dissipated on that last night, and I don't know what happened to it since then. And then in terms of policy, this is where I get dangerous because I'm not a water policy guy. But my understanding is that this issue has been solved in a number of basins, whether it's Yakima, whether it's Dungeness, and I think there's a couple of others, where it might have taken many, many years, but people got together, all the stakeholders, and they figured this out. From my perspective, my understanding is that there's about 6 basins that might theoretically be closed as a result of this ruling or the fix that we would do. Now, if that's the case, that's fine. Let's talk about those 6 basins from my perspective, those WIRAs, figure out what needs to happen so that development can continue to happen and that rural landowners like JT can have their water, can run their businesses, do what they need to do, but that we protect senior water rights. Why can't we just get together, figure out what it is in terms of water storage? It's going to cost a lot of money, but whatever it is to mitigate the problems in those handful of basins and fund it through the capital budget. To me, that would be like the low-hanging fruit to fix this. Everybody wins. We also create jobs through construction budgets and capital budgets. So why don't we just do that? And I just, without being in the room, it's just driving me a little bit crazy, and I'm not alone in terms of people not getting to yes. I don't understand why people can't get to yes on this.
Senator, let me ask you regarding the capital budget. Do you believe that either in the next regular session or maybe even a special session before that, do you think that that there should be a vote to pass the cash portion of the capital budget? $4 billion, there's a bond budget that requires 60%, and then there's a cash portion that just requires a simple majority. It's about, I think, 1.5 or 1.6 billion. do you think that that's been some talk that maybe Senate Democrats would come in and pass that budget, send it back to the House, which would also pass it, and at least release those funds? Do you think that that is smart policy, or do you think that the legislature should just make sure that it gets Hearst done right and stick with the connection?
I am not a proponent of a cash budget, and I don't think that that is where we're headed. I mean, I might be wrong on that, but no, I think that's just kicking the can down the road a little bit further. I mean, it's been now since January, and then we haven't got a solution. So kicking it a couple more months down the line, what's that going to do?
Yeah.
Either people want to get to yes and get a deal, or they don't. And we as a state can't afford to not have a full capital budget. I was with a friend last night. They have a men's-only facility for homeless people that they're trying to build in Snohomish right now, and they can't even go out to permit on it right now because the capital budget is held up. So we have an opioid crisis and we have a homeless crisis where I live, and we can't even address it through this charity who has a grant in the capital budget because we don't have a capital budget. So no, I'm not a fan of that.
Representative Wilcox, why not? Well, first, maybe you want to comment. Maybe you have some observation about what happened in that breakdown. My understanding is that House Democrats pulled out of that last-minute deal. Maybe I'm incorrect, but Senator Palumbo is shaking his head. Nope. But at any rate, maybe you have some observations on that, A. And B, why not at least move a temporary fix so that the families that are trying to maybe sell their homes or build their homes so that the real estate has value, at least in the near term? Why not? My understanding is that Republicans have not been willing to accept a temporary fix. Why not get something, or half a loaf rather than a full loaf?
Okay, well, first, the first part of your question, I think everybody's trying to figure out what happened that night. I was sitting in Joel Kretz's office at probably 5:30 in the morning when John Braun came up trying to figure out what happened. And I don't think it's absolutely accurate to say that there was a four-corner handshake deal. I don't think that one of the caucus's leadership shook hands on that. And I don't really accuse anyone of bad faith in this. I don't think there was bad faith. I think it was a tragedy that it waited until midnight till 3, something like that. The place is a very, very human place, and sometimes human stress just gets in the way of what you can do. And also, politics, more than people understand, is about timing. And there are moments when you can move, and then the opportunity is gone. And I wish that there was a better explanation for that, but that's what my experience there has told me. As far as a temporary fix, I think it goes back to the original point that I made. There is a strong sense among rural people and rural legislators that they're the only ones that have to care about this, and that if there was a partial fix, there would never, ever be a more comprehensive, long-lasting fix. Now, I think that many people have moved far beyond that original bill that was earlier referenced. So there's certainly efforts to get to the center here. I think that there's a few stumbling blocks. I'm not a negotiator in this, by the way, and I'm kind of glad I'm not, honestly. But I respect some of the best people that I know in the legislature are working hard on this, and I think that they have a lot of goodwill, and the consequences are dire enough for a lot of stakeholder groups that they're trying hard to get to the center too. But just because the consequences are dire for people that build homes, for people that own land, there's a lot of fear that if we don't get a sustainable deal now, there will never be a moment to get it again. And this will be one more of the long list of defeats that people feel. And I'm not totally speaking for myself here, but I think a lot of people think that there's just this immense list of defeats that rural folks have absorbed, and it's just not right to ask them to absorb one more.
I want to ask for your questions, and as you think about them, I'll just logistically say I'll repeat your questions so that we capture it for TVW and for video online. I also, for folks, obviously you're all interested in this or you wouldn't be here. I think it's it's a painful sort of situation to have to put yourself in. If you think about those property owners who maybe, they're ready to sell their homes and now can't because folks can't get financing from banks to buy a home that may or may not have value depending on their future water needs, or property land that may be developed but can't be because of their future property or water needs. So, questions from you all here in the audience? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I work for an organization that, I work for the architects, and they're impacted by the capital budget. So we've been doing what you do, which is go out and meeting with our officials, with constituents. And what we hear from constituents, or from the officials, is you need to talk to the other party, they have a problem. Almost uniformly, the negotiators, they know what they're talking about, so we have a good conversation there. But, politely, you need to talk to the other party, they're really the problem. And for a non-political person like our architects who just want to get their jobs going, they are so frustrated. And my question is, because you can tell them this is just a political problem. It's that we can't tell them, yes, we're hurting, because they know. To what extent are constituents sort of owed a legislator that works together? I mean, what do you tell your own constituents about sort of the inability to negotiate in certain areas? Because it starts to feel like the federal government, and then that doesn't feel good.
So the question is, in part, thank you for that, is in part, what are constituents owed by or from their legislators, particularly in the space where it takes some compromise and some ability to listen and collaborate to come to a difficult political solution? And how would you, Senator Palumbo, let me ask you first, how would you address her question?
Well, I think that, they are owed people that are willing to work with the other side. I think you're looking at two legislators right here who are known for it. I am happy to make any deal that meets to a middle ground on any policy with JT and his caucus, or the guys in the Senate, and the ladies in the Senate. I think that people are owed that. I mean, the gridlock that we see in Congress is horrible. Like, I hope that does not infect Olympia, that kind of thinking. But what they're owed, at least in my district, they're owed a capital budget. They're owed schools. I have two of the biggest school districts that are busting at the seams and adding an elementary school a year. They can't go out to bid on things to try to get room for kids. They got homeless problems. They can't go out for that. We have open space issues. We can't go out for that. So, I mean, I think they're owed a compromise. To your point about, being frustrated about the other side, it's their fault. It's their fault. I hate that kind of, blame game. It doesn't do anybody any good. But I do see a lot of it in the press, and when I read it in the press, it makes me frustrated as a lawmaker, just because I know that that's not the case. There's good people trying to get. I know the guys in his caucus that are negotiating it. They're good people. Judy Warnick, another example. Really good people with good hearts that are trying to do the right thing. It's just this. I think more than politics, it's this policy issue here with this. This is really tricky stuff. What's the phrase? Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting. I mean, I've been only there, one session, and I can see already that is so true. This is a really, really hard and emotional policy issue, and I think it's just hard. It's a hard policy thing right now.
Jim? Or JT, do you want to take a crack?
Yeah, I would like to answer that. It's not the most uncommon question. And, it kind of depends on who's asking that question as well. Nobody elects you to go down there and surrender either. And, this is, I think, boy, when I do a lot of social media, because there's no other media in my district, or there's some weeklies, and actually they're great, so I shouldn't put them down. But there's no radio station, there's no TV station, no one's, beating down my door to come down to the farm and film my thoughts. So I do social media, and I will tell you that even though, as you can probably tell from my demeanor here, I am not a rabble-rouser. I don't try to raise issues in ways that are as polarizing as possible. What I have done on this issue has been as resonant as anything I've ever done in politics. So these people feel deeply, and like I said, it's not just people that are unable at this point to drill a well and build a home. People are very committed to this, and no one would come to me and say, Wilcox, you owe me a surrender on this. At least no one lives in my district. And as I've said, I think that there's been a lot of movements, and the truth is, I know where this is going to go in the end. There's really, in practical terms, a reasonable solution out there. I would say one of the larger problems here, and this can be reflected by either caucus, is in order to maintain caucus cohesion, all across the country, caucuses have begun adopting a rule, some people call it the Hastert rule, that says we won't bring a bill to the floor unless we can pass it with the votes in our caucus. Well, when it's a 25-24 chamber, that means that you have to be unanimous, or you don't bring the bill to the floor. If you're in the House, that means that it's a 50-48 chamber, and you have to be unanimous, or you don't bring a bill to the floor. I am pretty sure that there are a wide variety of fixes, Hearst bills, that if they came to the floor for a vote, not all of them would, but if they came to the floor for a vote, they would pass. So this is a problem that is a demonstration of how hard it is to manage caucuses in today's world, and also a reflection that Washington State, when it comes to legislative districts, is about as evenly divided as you can possibly get. And you know, nobody hates this stuff more than us. Is it easy to look in the mirror in the middle of a session when you know, or in the middle of a special session, when you know that in your professional life, you know, you should be ashamed of yourself if you can't come to a deal? I hate that part of this job. It is hard to face my children and the people that depend on us, but you don't solve it by deciding that one side is going to surrender. What you do, I think, is try hard to figure out, where is this going to go? How can I spend, if we're going to be deadlocked for 3 months, how can I spend that 3 months trying to find stakeholders that will support the solution that I think it's going to end up? And, you know, to me, the responsible legislators aren't the Republicans or the Democrats. They're not the people that say blame the other side. They're the people that are getting the conversation going and preparing their constituents and other stakeholders for what the compromise is going to look like in the end. That is responsible legislating, even if it may take a heck of a lot longer than you would like it to take. I'm sorry, that got a little long.
That's good.
And I want to echo that. I hate the Hastert rule. JT's right. I mean, democracy should break out on the floor of the Senate and the House whenever possible, in my opinion.
I'm wondering if you would agree that there's a little more than legislative policy here. And what I mean by that is you all have an issue that's been really, part of it's been given to you by the state Supreme Court. Now, I'd be the last person to say that the contributions to their campaigns do anything to color their judicial objectivity. However, this is not just an easy policy thing for you all. This thing comes in out of the Supreme Court. And it is possible that over the last decade or more, the legislative branch has respectfully, how do I say this, maybe not stepped up to its balance of power. And so the question is it actually more complicated because of the role of the judiciary here on one part of it? Or is it, do you see it just merely as an arm wrestling over a policy issue?
So the question is, if I might reframe it, is this relatively straightforward in terms of policy, or is this more complicated by the role that the Supreme Court has played and in the questioner's opinion that perhaps the legislature has not been as co-equal as it could have been in recent years with the other branch?
That's exactly what I said.
Well, very good. You know, I'm not a lawyer, and I usually don't get into that kind of question, but I will reflect some experiences that I've had in the 7 years that I've been doing this. It is amazing to me how much of our budget now, especially, you know, kind of the discretionary part of our spending, has been taken over by court cases. And some will say, well, that's because you're not doing your job. There may be something to part of that. But I think the rigidity that the court has adopted in terms of you need to solve this problem, and we're going to tell you how to do it, or sometimes even worse, you better guess exactly how we want you to do it. That I think is an immense problem, and you know it was probably made worse because there's not just Hearst and McCleary. There's a whole bunch of ones around health that we never really push back on. You know, we kind of agree that we need to do a better job on this, so we go along, and there's been very little institutional pushback, in part because, you know, probably the court reflects the desires of the majority caucuses in many cases, so why fight it? And because of that, we probably haven't stood up for the institution as we should have. It's a great question, one that we do talk about a little bit, but generally it is confined to what others might think are the wild and crazy fringe members, and we should make this separation of powers a little more mainstream, I think, and at the same time sort of wonder. This is going to be partisan, but I'll tell you, if my party had been in power for 20 years, I'd be on the other side probably, because this is also a product of single-party government over generations. And what happens is it becomes very self-reinforcing, and I don't think it's healthy. And it wouldn't be healthy regardless of which party held that.
I'll just related, not exactly, I haven't been there long enough that JT has the knowledge of these court decisions. He's been living with them, so I'm kind of new. But on the issue of the court, I think there's one thing regarding Hearst that is just the perspective that I've heard from some people that are not deep in the weeds, right? So, you know, take the McCleary case. So the Supreme Court ruled. You know, the legislature wouldn't overturn a Supreme Court ruling. That's not something that's done. You know, the fish culvert case. You know, the legislature's not going to overturn the court's case. And now we have a Hearst case. So, you know, the expectation, if there is one, that we would overturn it legislatively is kind of a non-starter. And it doesn't matter if it's, you know, and I'll go to another one, charter school law. I'm a pro-charter person. I don't like the charter school ruling, but we have to live with it. It's why we have co-equal branches of government. So just to give you that perspective, I think a lot of the things early on in session seem to be focused on us overturning Hearst, essentially, which is kind of a non-starter for most of our caucus. So I just want to give you that perspective as it relates to Hearst.
So from one former legislator to another former legislator in the back. Jeff?
I'm just curious, you know, I mean, we've got a really difficult policy situation here with the water issue, and it's going to take, you know, some real clever people to figure out the solution to that. But we've also got a hostage situation, really, in my estimation. You've got a sort of an unrelated issue. You've got, you know, kids who need classrooms, you know, being pitted against, you know, rural landowners who need water. And I'm just curious your thoughts about how that hostage taking and how that dynamic carries into the future. I mean, is this common in Olympia? And if so, do you think it's good for our democracy? And do you think there's any end in sight to it?
JT will know better if it's been.
Let me
happening.
restate the question for folks watching. Is the questioner posed this as hostage taking, and posed the sort of on the one hand the children who are waiting for new classrooms or refurbished classrooms in the balance with those rural landowners who are trying to access water rights. And how long did you serve, Jeff? For 10 years. He wonders if is this normal in Olympia?
So Jeff knows the answer, but it's still a good question. You know, I'll go back and recharacterize maybe one thing. I think rural landowners, and I've used that phrase too, dehumanizes it a little bit too much. You know, people that have been there for generations, Wilcox Farms, we don't have a problem with our water rights. I was fortunate in my choice of a great-grandfather and a grandfather, and they took care of all this. This is about families that want to build on small lots or perform small businesses. These are just regular people. These are not captains of industry. They're not the people that the opening speaker was talking about being part of the problem. These are actually middle-class people that have a dream that used to be a very common and mainstream dream, and they feel cheated. And it's not just about the money. Although the money can be overwhelming if you already bought your place. You know, if you've already mortgaged yourself to do that, and all of a sudden you cannot get a loan to build your home, and maybe you sold your home to get that property. So I will never allow. I can't be silent when people say, "Oh, you're hurting people with the capital budget for the sake of a few rural landowners." These are equally important people in my mind. There may be less of them, but in the long run, there's going to be a lot of them too. And as I mentioned before, this maybe isn't the ideal bill. And if I was making that choice, I don't know that I would have made that, but I don't know that I wouldn't have either. You can call it hostage taking if you like that kind of imagery. It is absolutely an everyday occurrence to be trading bills for bills, especially at the end of a session. In fact, if you ever watch on TVW and you wonder how we can put up with coming out, running out one bill, then going back into caucus and watching Norm Johnson sleep inside the caucus room, and then come out an hour later, it's because the two majority caucuses are trading bills. They're saying, sadly, sometimes we don't trust you. You pass this bill, and then we'll pass that bill. That happens probably on, explicitly 10 or 15 major bills at the end of every session or every special session, and less visibly to a large variety of bills during the session too. So this is not unprecedented at all, but it does involve one of the budgets, and so that actually has made it much more visible. But do I like it? No, I don't. But I also think that if a critical concern to at least half the state can't be addressed, there has to be a way to raise the level of concern so that it is addressed. And when we could not get a bill out of the House, I'm not sure where that left anybody but surrender or trade bills or take hostages, as the question phrased it.
It's a delicate matter because you can hear it in JT's voice, and I've gotten to know JT over the last several years, and you can hear the passion and the honesty, and when he talks about rural landowners. And like I said, I'm one. I live on 5 acres. I live next to a conservation area in the woods. It's important that we don't degrade rural landowners. And like you said, it's not Microsoft out with a data center. It's mom and pop that are just trying to get their house built or sold. So that's a serious concern. So we have to be careful the way we talk about it. Regarding the hostage taking, I agree, it is hostage taking. I haven't been there long enough to know what JT says is true. Definitely the trading, the horse trading. I got to see that up close this year. It's quite interesting, and I'm enthusiastic about it because I like making deals. I don't know if there's ever been this case where, my understanding is this is the first time in state history we haven't gotten a capital budget. So, that's a big deal. It's not just one policy bill. We're not going to give you this policy bill until you give us this policy bill. This is a budget that affects the whole state. And obviously that was leverage that, they felt they needed. Whoever made that decision, I don't know. It didn't work out clearly, and it hasn't worked out since. So I think that it was a failed experiment, in my opinion. But in terms of poisoning the atmosphere, I can tell you that at least in my caucus, it was very poisonous. We are not vindictive where we're going to say, hey, we're going to do this now too. So you're not going to see that out of us. But it definitely is continuing to leave extremely bad feelings in a lot of people's mouths that care about the capital budget.
wonder that we have some rural problems. I represent many people who live in rural areas with water systems that we own or run for them. And I'll let you know, as legislators, you're going to be dealing with people citing, or our state's still growing, citing school districts that can't find water. They're coming to us looking for it. And we have a certain amount of available water rights, but it's an unsolved problem when you expand your school district in a rural area. Where's the water?
So the comment related to the fact that since 93, 94, the audience member has never seen a lack of hearings in the capital budget process, which we saw in the Senate this last year, and that we're going to see a series of school districts continue to go to his PUD district and other PUD districts trying to find water to be able to continue to build and support their schools. We have time for one more question if anyone has one. Right up here, sir.
Can I comment on that real quick?
Sure.
Just want to mention about the order. You're right. And I think this wasn't a House problem. I think it was a Senate problem. And this was my experience in my first year. Going to the regular order where you actually hear a bill in committee, flush out the details, pass it out, send it to Ways or a fiscal committee, send it to, they have the debate, have the transparency. I'm a democracy nerd. Our chamber did not run like that. That was a decision by the people that were in charge. But I can't tell you, forget about just the capital budget. There were so many policy bills that where normally you get into caucus and you have your chair say, a little briefing on, we heard in committee, this is what it does, this is why you might like it, this is why you might not like it. I can't tell you how many times chairs in my caucus had to look at the book and go, I don't even know what this bill is because they just sent it to Ways and Means. And they didn't have a hearing. It was like a 10-second hearing. I think what you're going to find, it's actually top on our list for my caucus now that we're in charge, to go back to the regular order so that people can actually see the bills we're passing, we can understand it and develop good policy.
We're really short on time, but go ahead, sir.
So I represent the students of Eastern Washington University, and they kind of see this as kind of like party politics, and that's kind of a really big issue that a lot of people my age are having. And my question is really, is if this type of stuff keeps on happening, what does it mean for our state of our democracy when we have legislators who are elected by less than 50% of our population? Right? It's a growing smaller group of people who are actually voting and who are actually putting you in office. What does that mean for our state of democracy when less and less people are actually coming out to vote because of this kind of stuff?
So a student who represents the students at Eastern Washington University asks the question, essentially, cutting to the chase, what does this say about the state of our Republican democracy in Washington State?
Well, that's a interesting and not an unfair connection to make, I think. The standard answer is if you watch TVW and we're doing floor action, you're going to see probably 90% of the bills come out either unanimous or near unanimous. So what gets the attention is the ones that create the maximum amount of drama, which is usually about conflict. And because there's almost no state house press coverage anymore, it's only
we're working on it.
Yeah. It's only the big divisive stories that come out, or else it's the social media. And, the people that attract the biggest following on social media tend to be the ones that are the best at motivating their angry voters. That's not true in every case, but it's true in some cases. But I don't think it's a problem you notice I didn't say with millennials, for millennials. It's a problem for voters in every demographic group, even though they may have formed more consistent voting habits in the past. And I guess I think it is in part about the nutty partisanship that we have and the fact that people are looking at every detail through their ideology. That's the screen or the lens that they're using. To me, there's a ton of stuff that doesn't have to be ideological. And none of us should have 100% voting records with every single interest group or stakeholder group. There's a lot of just common sense stuff that gets turned right now into ideology. And I think that turns people off. And then, I think I'm still reflecting on what Nick Hanauer said, you know, you've got to be more aggressive, you've got to do all these things, and the problem is, the basic problem in our country is economics. I don't really agree with that. I think the basic problem that you have to fix by your behavior, if you're a leader or a politician, is people don't trust you. People don't trust the government, and we give them plenty of reasons to do that. And in general, it comes because so many people are willing to say A and do B, and make promises and not follow through. One rule that I try to have, I don't make many promises. You know, my whole theory of running for office is I want to share my values as openly as I possibly can, and people can take an honest choice. Do I want this person expressing his values when he pushes that red or green button? And then do I want him explaining his actions to me, because I deserve that, or not? And
let me have you end it there, Representative Wilcox, so I can get Senator Palumbo to promise me that he'll wrap it up. Last word with 1 minute.
I'm glad you asked that question. I think that we have to change some structural things. Now, this is not to say anything bad about my colleagues, because there is such good people in the Senate, and you don't. And to JT's point, you never get reporting on it, and you don't get to see it. When I got there, I thought it was completely divisive. On the floor, there's a family. There's so much goodwill and working together. Maybe you don't always see that, but it happens. But you never get to see it on the outside. But regarding your point about democracy, we have to reform the systems, because right now, in a primary, the way our primary is run, first of all, we have it when people are out of school in August, so we're assured 30% turnout. So to your point, 30% of the people are picking who we all get to vote in a general for. So in my opinion, we have to move the primary to when either up in May, when people are still in school, or back to September. I'm also a proponent of ranked choice voting and some other ideas, but those are a little radical for most folks. But basically, the party structure is set up to go to the extremes, right? So I am not Democrat enough, right? I beat an incumbent. I think JT did as well. You're looking at two people that like kind of ran anti-establishment a little bit, even though we might be lifelong Democrats and Republicans. But that's not the norm. The norm is I'm going to run and figure out how I can get that motivated base of that 30% to vote for me in a primary. So I have to be as far left as I can be, or I have to be as far right as I can be. And the people that vote in primaries tend to be 60 and older, you know, party line voters. So they're going to vote for whatever the establishment says. This guy's a Democrat, this guy's a Republican. So we have to fix that primary challenge, because by the time the general comes, it's already decided in most districts. We only have a handful of truly swing districts. So whatever the R is, whatever the D is in my district, and the general is going to win. So the primary is where you actually have your choice, but only 30% vote.
On that note, this 30% is going to be motivated to thank you, and let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you very much.